I guess I've always thought of myself as just a regular person. I mean, you know, the kind of person who goes to work every day, takes care of their family, and keeps the house running. I never expected my life to end up like this. Never thought I'd find myself standing on the edge of something I can't undo. But here I am, sharing this story, hoping that somehow someone will understand, or maybe even offer a way out. My name is Olivia. I've been married to Ethan for almost 20 years. We have 2 kids, Jake and Lily. It used to be just the 4 of us, living a simple, suburban life. We lived in a nice house in a quiet neighborhood in Michigan, nothing too fancy. But it felt like home. Ethan worked in finance, always busy, always climbing the ladder. I stayed home, raised the kids, kept everything in order. For the longest time, I was content with that. Or at least I convinced myself I was. Ethan used to be different, though. Before all this, before the distance, the silence, the loneliness, I used to feel seen by him. I remember when we first met, back in college. He was this charming guy with a quick wit, always laughing, always pulling me into the conversation. We'd stay up late talking about everything and nothing. He made me feel like the most important person in the room. But somewhere along the way, all that faded. I used to tell myself it was because of work. He had to provide for us. Right? That's what he said. Anyway, he worked long hours, overtime, weekends, holidays, and I told myself it was for the family, for the future. But after a while, you start to realize that the future never comes. And here I was, sitting in a house full of empty rooms, surrounded by people who weren't really there. Jake, my son, was 16 when everything started to unravel. He was becoming a teenager, quiet, distant, like most boys that age. He didn't talk much, mostly kept to himself, but there was a certain softness in him, something I hadn't seen before. He looked so much like Ethan, with those deep brown eyes. But his face was a little gentler, less guarded. And then there was Lily, our little girl, full of life and energy, always asking questions, always running around with that infectious laugh. They were my world, the ones I cared about, even when Ethan seemed like a ghost living in our house. But things between Ethan and me? Well, that was a different story. We stopped talking. Or maybe I stopped talking. And he just stopped listening. It was subtle at first, small things. Like him not asking about my day. Or not noticing when I looked tired. Then it became bigger. He'd come home late, too tired to even glance at me. Barely noticing I was there. I could feel myself slipping further away from him. But I didn't know how to fix it. So I kept pretending everything was fine. Doing what I always did. Taking care of the kids. Keeping up appearances. Holding it all together. But deep down, I was dying. That's when I started noticing how much I was alone. I don't mean alone in the sense of being physically by myself. Because I wasn't. I had Jake and Lily. I had Ethan, though he might as well have been a stranger. I was alone in a different way. I was invisible. Ethan didn't see me anymore. I could go days without him really looking at me. Without him asking how I felt. What I wanted. I'd try to talk to him about little things. About the kids. About the bills. About life. And it was like speaking to a wall. He was there, but not really. I used to get angry about it. But then I just stopped. I stopped fighting. I stopped hoping. And I started convincing myself that maybe this was just how life worked. Maybe this was what being married for so long meant. Getting used to the silence. getting used to being overlooked. Then there was the trip to the beach. I don't even know why I went through with it. Ethan had to work, like always, so it was just Jake and me. It should have been a simple, relaxing day out, but something about that day felt different. Maybe it was because I needed something, anything, to remind me that I was still alive. Maybe I was hoping that the sunshine, the waves, the fresh air would fix everything. But I should have known better. You can't fix something that's been broken for so long with a day at the beach. It wasn't anything out of the ordinary at first. We spread out the towels, set up the umbrella, and Jake went off to the water for a while. I remember lying down on the towel, feeling the warmth of the sun soak into my skin. I closed my eyes and tried to let the weight of everything fall away. Even if just for a little bit, I told myself I'd relax. But I couldn't stop thinking about Ethan. I thought about the way we used to laugh together. How his hand used to feel in mine. The way he'd look at me. I hadn't felt that in years. Eventually, I asked Jake to rub some oil on my back. It wasn't anything weird. He was my son, and I didn't think twice about it. It was a simple thing, a way for him to help. A way for me to feel a little less tense. But when his hands touched me, I felt something shift. It wasn't anything dramatic at first. But it was there. It was like his touch lingered just a little longer than necessary. I told myself it was fine. That it was just his hands helping. But deep down, I knew something was off. I didn't stop him. I didn't pull away. And then it hit me. I was alone. But I wasn't just alone in the house anymore. I was alone in my own skin. In my own life. And I didn't know how to fix it. Jake didn't say anything. He just did what I asked him to do. But I could feel him. I could feel the tension in the air. I should have stopped it, but I didn't. Instead, I just let it happen. Like I didn't have the strength to fight it anymore. That day, on that beach, everything changed. It wasn't a huge moment. There were no dramatic words spoken. No life-shattering arguments. But I knew that I would never be the same. That day at the beach. It started out like any other trip we'd ever taken together. Jake and I used to do these little outings sometimes, just the two of us. When Ethan couldn't make it, they weren't frequent, but they were enough to remind me that I wasn't completely invisible. Not to Jake, at least. The drive there was quiet. I didn't mind it. The silence was comfortable in a way. Familiar. Jake had his earbuds in, eyes glued to the window, lost in whatever world he had in his head. I knew he wasn't mad at me. He wasn't mad at anyone. He was just in that phase. Teenage boys don't really know how to show what they feel. And maybe he was just going through his own stuff. We all were, in a way. I tried to talk a little, telling him that the weather looked perfect, and that it felt like the right day to just get away for a while. I think he nodded or something. But he didn't really say much. And that was fine. I didn't need him to. He was here, and that was enough. When we finally got there, the beach wasn't as crowded as I expected. Which was nice. There was something calming about a quiet beach. Just the sound of the waves and the wind. The smell of the salt in the air. It felt like we had a little piece of the world to ourselves for just a few hours. We unloaded the car, grabbed the towels, the umbrella, and the cooler. Jake didn't even hesitate to help. It was like old times, him carrying his share, me carrying mine. But there was a different energy between us now. Something I couldn't ignore. I felt a tension that hadn't been there before. Something I didn't know how to deal with. Maybe it was the heat. Or maybe it was just how quiet everything was. But it felt like the world had slowed down for us. Like we were stuck in a moment where everything could change. But neither of us knew how to name it. We spread out the towels. And Jake set up the umbrella like a pro. He was growing up fast. And in that moment, I realized how much he had changed. His voice had dropped. His shoulders had broadened a bit. I could still see my little boy in him. The one who used to hold my hand when we crossed the street. The one who used to climb into my lap when he was scared. But now, there was this distance, an invisible line that neither of us had crossed yet. But I felt it. I felt the space between us getting wider. I laid down on my towel, trying to relax, but it was harder than I thought. The sun was beating down, maybe a little too hot, but it felt good in some strange way. I closed my eyes and let the warmth seep into my skin. But my mind kept wandering back to everything I'd been pushing down for so long. Ethan, the emptiness, the loneliness. And then I remembered, I had forgotten to bring the sunscreen. The thought crossed my mind. And for a moment, I just lay there, feeling the sun getting hotter on my back. I didn't want to get up, didn't want to move, but I also didn't want to burn. So I turned to Jake. "Hey, can you help me rub this oil on my back?" I asked. My voice came out lighter than I felt. It wasn't a big deal. I told myself. He was my son. He'd helped me before when he was little. After swimming or a long day outside. It was just a small thing. He was still my kid. Still my boy. There was a pause. I looked up at him. And for a second, I saw hesitation in his eyes. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe it was just the heat. The exhaustion. The way everything felt off that day. But then he nodded. He didn't say anything. Just reached over and grabbed the bottle of sunscreen from my hand. I laid back down, face in the towel, and closed my eyes again. I could hear Jake moving behind me. Opening the bottle, the sound of the lotion being squirted out. He was careful when he touched my back. Just like he always had been. I didn't think much of it at first. It was just his hands. Just a normal thing. But as he started to rub the oil in, something inside me shifted. His touch was softer than I remembered. Gentler. As though he was trying to be extra careful. Trying not to hurt me. I don't know why it struck me as odd. But it did. The air felt thicker all of a sudden. And I could feel the warmth of his hands on my skin in a way I hadn't expected. I wanted to move, to sit up, to tell him to stop. But I didn't. I just stayed there, eyes closed, pretending that everything was fine. That this was just a mother and her son. That nothing was wrong. "Is this okay?" he asked. His voice quieter now, almost unsure. I nodded. Though I didn't really know why. It felt fine, but also not. Something in the air was different. And I couldn't name it. I didn't want to. I just wanted the moment to end. For it to feel like it used to. "You can press a little harder," I said, the words coming out more easily than I expected. I don't know why I said it. Maybe it was the heat. Maybe it was the years of being starved for attention. For touch. For feeling like someone actually saw me. It had been so long since I'd felt anyone's hands on me that it felt strange. But at the same time, it felt like something I needed. Jake's hands pressed down a little harder. Moving along my back. His touch was firm now. Like he wasn't as hesitant anymore. It felt good. I felt the tension in my body start to melt away. And for a moment, I forgot about everything else. The silence at home. The emptiness. The way Ethan never looked at me. For just that second, I felt like I mattered. Like someone was paying attention. But then it happened. His hands moved lower. Just a little. Near the curve of my back. And I felt it. A shiver. My breath caught in my throat. And I felt a surge of something. Fear. Desire. Confusion. All mixed together. I wanted to say something. I wanted to tell him to stop. To pull away. But I didn't. I stayed still. My heart pounding in my chest. I think that's enough. Jake, I wanted to say. But the words wouldn't come out. Instead, I stayed quiet, holding my breath. But then, I said it, and I still don't know why. It's okay. You can rub there too. The moment I said those words, everything changed. The air around us seemed to freeze. Jake didn't say anything. He didn't stop either. He just continued. And that was the moment when everything I had known, everything I had been trying to protect, began to unravel. After that day at the beach, I couldn't shake the feeling that something inside me had broken. I didn't know exactly what it was. Maybe it was the guilt. Maybe the confusion. Maybe something deeper that I didn't want to face. But it was there, like a shadow hanging over everything, making every moment feel heavier than the last. And when we got back home, everything felt just as it always had. Ethan came in late, as usual. He kissed Lily on the forehead, barely glancing at me. His tie was loose, his face tired from a long day at the office. I'd gotten so used to the routine by now. He would come home, take a quick shower, and then retreat to his study or the living room. His body was in the house, but his mind was always somewhere else. I couldn't even bring myself to be angry anymore. I didn't have the energy for it. I had tried. Years ago, I had tried to talk to him, to tell him how I felt, to explain that I needed him. But those conversations always ended the same way, his apologetic shrug, his promise to do better, and then, like clockwork, nothing changed. It was like I was invisible to him. Like he had stopped seeing me as a person. As his wife, I was just the woman who took care of everything, kept everything running. And he, well, he was the one who worked. I used to tell myself that he was doing it for us. That all those long hours, the late nights at the office, the missed weekends, it was for the family, for the future. But the future never came. And now, all I could see was an empty house. An empty life. Ethan had become a shadow in our home. And I had become a shadow in his life. That night, as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling while Ethan snored softly beside me, I felt that same emptiness. The house was quiet, but my mind was anything but. My thoughts kept racing back to that day on the beach. The feeling of Jake's hands on me. The way it felt like something had shifted. Something that couldn't be undone. But the worst part wasn't just that moment. The worst part was how it made me feel alive. For the first time in years. Seen. In a world where Ethan didn't look at me. Where he barely acknowledged my existence. Jake's touch made me feel something. Something dangerous. Something wrong. But something I couldn't ignore. And that scared me. It scared me because I knew it wasn't just about Jake or the touch. It was about everything that had been missing in my life for so long. It was about the loneliness that had seeped into my bones over the years. The quiet resignation that this was just how it was going to be. I had stopped asking for more. I had stopped expecting more. But the moment Jake's hands lingered on my back, I realized how much I had been starving for it, for attention, for affection, for someone to see me. Really see me. The next few days went by in a blur. I tried to act normal. Tried to keep up the charade like everything was fine. I went through the motions, making dinner, folding laundry, helping Lily with her homework. I kept telling myself that if I just kept my head down, if I just kept doing what I always did, things would get better. But the silence in the house was deafening. Ethan would come home, greet the kids, kiss me on the cheek out of habit, and then disappear into his world. I used to wonder if he even remembered who I was anymore. But I knew the truth. He had forgotten. And so had I in a way. I had forgotten what it felt like to be noticed, to be cared for. I had settled into this existence where I was just a fixture in the background. There but not really present. I couldn't remember the last time we had had a real conversation. Not just about the bills or the kids or the day-to-day stuff. But something real, something that made me feel like we were still a team. Still a couple. It had been years since I had felt that. Since I had felt anything from Ethan. And the worst part? I didn't know how to fix it. I didn't know how to break through the walls that had built up between us. Walls that had been made of silence, neglect, and unspoken words. Every time I tried to reach out, to ask for something more, I was met with his tired indifference. He didn't mean to hurt me. I knew that. He wasn't a bad person. But he was so consumed by his work, so caught up in his own world, that he forgot I was in it. And so, I started to fade into the background. Like the furniture, like the walls. I started to wonder if I was even real to him anymore. I had spent so many years making excuses for him, telling myself that he worked hard for us, that this was just a phase, that it would get better. But the truth was, it had been years, and nothing had changed. I remember one night, after dinner, when the kids had gone to bed, and I was cleaning up the kitchen. Ethan sat at the table, flipping through his phone, barely glancing up. I could have asked him about his day, but I didn't. I already knew the answer. Work, as always. And I knew he wasn't really listening. I was just another part of the background noise. Like the hum of the dishwasher or the ticking of the clock on the wall. Do you ever feel like we're just existing? I asked, before I could stop myself. My voice sounded hollow even to me. He didn't look up from his phone. What do you mean? I don't know. Just, like we're just going through the motions. You know? He shrugged. I guess. Things are busy. I'll have more time when this project's over. But I knew better. I knew that project would never be over. There would always be another deadline. Another meeting. Another reason for him to be gone. And I would always be here. In this house. Waiting for him to notice me. Waiting for him to see me. But it was clear now that I had become invisible to him. And maybe, just maybe, I had become invisible to myself, too. I couldn't help but wonder, had I always been like this? Had I always just accepted things as they were, never pushing for more? Or had this silence, this neglect, slowly chipped away at the person I used to be, until there was nothing left but a shell? As the days passed, I started to realize something. I wasn't just lonely because of Ethan's neglect. I was lonely because I had allowed myself to be invisible. I had let the years of silence build up until it became my reality. And now, when I was faced with something I couldn't control, something I couldn't ignore, I didn't know how to fix it. I couldn't fix Ethan. And I didn't know if I could fix me. It was hard to ignore the growing tension between Jake and me after that day at the beach. I kept telling myself it was just in my head, that it was nothing, that I was overthinking it. But deep down, I knew something had shifted. The air between us had thickened, and no matter how much I tried to push it away, I couldn't escape the nagging feeling that things had gone too far. Jake wasn't a little boy anymore. He wasn't the child who needed me to hold his hand when we crossed the street or the boy who climbed into my lap when he had a bad dream. He was growing up, and I could see the changes in him every day. The way he held himself now. The way he looked at me. It was different. I tried to ignore it. I tried to act like nothing was wrong. But there were moments when I caught him staring at me, and I would feel this chill run down my spine. It wasn't just a casual glance. It wasn't just the gaze of a son looking at his mother. It was something else, something I couldn't explain. Every time he looked at me, I could feel it, the weight of it, the way he seemed to be waiting for something, waiting for me to say something, do something. But I couldn't. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know what to do. I was lost, trapped in this twisted web of my own making. And every time Jake's eyes met mine, I felt like I was suffocating under the pressure. The guilt was unbearable. I hated myself for letting it go this far, for not stopping it when I had the chance. But the truth was, I didn't know how. I didn't know how to stop it. Because in some dark corner of my mind, I didn't want to. I didn't want to feel invisible anymore. I didn't want to feel like I was just another background character in my own life. I wanted someone to see me, to need me, to care about me, and Jake, in some twisted way, had become that someone. I couldn't stop thinking about that moment on the beach. His hands on my back. The way he touched me. I told myself it was nothing. That it was just a moment. A lapse in judgment. A mistake that I could erase. But the more I told myself that, the more I realized that I wasn't ready to forget it. It had become a part of me. A part of this ugly truth that I couldn't shake. It was there, haunting me, every time I saw Jake. Every time he spoke to me. The tension kept building. Every time we were in the same room, I could feel it between us. It wasn't just the silent looks or the lingering touches. It was something deeper, something that had wrapped itself around my heart and refused to let go. It was like we were both walking on a tightrope, one misstep away from falling off, and neither of us knew how to make it stop. The moments when we were alone together grew more frequent. Jake would find ways to stay close to me, to touch me, and I didn't stop him. It was like we were both testing the waters, seeing how far we could push the boundaries without crossing the line completely. I hated myself for it, but I couldn't seem to help it. Every time he brushed up against me, every time his hand lingered just a little too long, I felt something stir inside me. Something that I couldn't control. It was wrong, and I knew it, but in those moments, it felt like it was the only thing that was real. The only thing that made me feel anything at all. I tried to distract myself. I kept busy with the kids, with the house, with anything that could take my mind off what was happening. But it didn't work. The guilt gnawed at me, eating away at every piece of my sanity. I was betraying Ethan, betraying Jake, betraying myself. But it was like I was caught in a current. And no matter how hard I tried to swim in the opposite direction, I couldn't break free. Then, one night, it happened again. I was in the kitchen, preparing dinner, when Jake walked in. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there in the doorway, watching me. I didn't look up. I couldn't. I was afraid if I did, I'd see something in his eyes that I wasn't ready to face. I tried to focus on the task in front of me. Chopping vegetables, stirring the pot on the stove. But I could feel him there. Behind me, his presence like a weight pressing down on my chest. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. "What's up, Jake?" I asked, keeping my voice steady, though I could feel the tension crackling in the air between us. He didn't answer right away. He just stepped closer, closer than I had expected. Close enough that I could feel the heat of his body against mine. I froze. My heart skipped a beat. And for a moment, I couldn't breathe. Can you help me with something?" he asked. His voice low, almost hesitant. It was a question, but it wasn't really. There was something in the way he said it that made my skin prickle with unease. "Sure," I said, trying to sound normal, trying to act like this wasn't happening. Like I wasn't aware of the way my heart was racing. The way my palms were starting to sweat. I turned around to face him. And for a split second, our eyes met, and then I saw it, the longing. The desperation. It wasn't just a glance. It was a question, an invitation, and I knew it without him saying a word. I couldn't stop myself. I took a step back, my back hitting the counter behind me. The space between us was small, but it felt like an ocean. A vast, empty ocean that neither of us knew how to cross. I can't," I said, my voice breaking. Barely a whisper, but even as the words left my mouth, I knew it was too late. The tension between us had already snapped. It had already broken something inside me. Something I didn't know how to fix. Jake didn't say anything. He just stood there, his eyes never leaving mine, as if waiting for me to make the next move. And I was too afraid to move at all. The days that followed felt like a slow unraveling. It was as if everything around me had been moving in slow motion. But the weight of it all, the guilt, the confusion, the tension, was dragging me down with each passing hour. I couldn't stop thinking about Jake, about what had happened, and about the feeling that had settled between us. Heavy and undeniable. It was suffocating. But it was also the only thing that seemed to make me feel alive. Even if it was wrong. I kept busy. I did what I always did. Tended to the kids. Cleaned the house. Cooked dinner. I went through the motions. All the while trying to ignore the way Jake's presence seemed to fill up every space in the house. It wasn't even that he was doing anything different. It was just the way he looked at me now. The way his eyes seemed to linger on me a little longer than they should. The way his body seemed to stay a little too close. It was like there was an unspoken tension hanging in the air. And no matter how hard I tried to pretend it wasn't there, I couldn't avoid it. Then came the next weekend. Ethan had another work commitment, of course. It seemed like that was all he did anymore. And I had long since stopped questioning it. It was the same old story. Another project. Another late night. Another weekend away. So, it was just Jake and me again. Just the two of us. I didn't plan it, at least, not consciously. But when I found myself standing in the kitchen that Saturday morning, staring out the window, I realized that I was getting ready to do it again. I was going to ask Jake to come with me to the beach. I don't know why I decided to do it. Maybe it was because I needed to feel something. Anything. Outside of the walls of this house. Maybe I thought that a change of scenery would help. Would clear my mind. Would somehow make everything go back to normal. Maybe I wanted to test myself. to see if I could go back to how things used to be, before everything had changed. I don't know, but I called out to Jake as he passed through the living room. "Hey, Jake," I said, my voice a little unsteady, but I tried to hide it. "Want to go to the beach today? Just the two of us?" He stopped, looking at me for a moment. He was leaning against the doorway, and his expression was hard to read. I couldn't tell if he was surprised, confused, or maybe just too tired to care. But after a long pause, he nodded. "Sure, Mom. Sounds good." I didn't ask him what he thought about it or if he had other plans. It didn't matter. It wasn't like we were doing anything wrong. I told myself that, but I knew better. I knew deep down that this wasn't just a simple trip to the beach. It couldn't be. Nothing was simple anymore, not between us. We loaded up the car, beach towels, sunscreen, snacks, and headed out. The drive was quiet again. Jake had his earbuds in, just like before, staring out the window, his face unreadable. I tried to think of something to say, but the words never came. What was there to say? How could I talk to him like this? Like everything was fine? Like we hadn't crossed a line the last time we were alone together? The drive to the beach seemed longer than it usually did. The silence pressing down on me, suffocating me. I kept my eyes on the road, trying to focus on anything other than the nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach. It was the same feeling I had last weekend, when we'd been at the beach. This sense of impending doom. Like we were walking towards something we couldn't turn back from. When we finally arrived, the beach was empty, save for a few scattered families enjoying the warmth of the sun. It was peaceful, almost serene, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the quiet wasn't a comfort, it was a warning. A warning that things between Jake and me were about to change again. That we were about to step deeper into dangerous territory. We set up our towels and umbrella. Jake was quieter than usual, his movements slow and deliberate, as though he was still processing something. I didn't know what to say, so I just sat down, facing the ocean, and tried to breathe. The sound of the waves crashing against the shore was soothing, but it didn't calm the storm brewing inside me. I couldn't bring myself to ask him again, like I had last time. I couldn't ask him to rub the sunscreen on my back. That would have been crossing a line, wouldn't it? But as I lay there on the towel, feeling the heat of the sun on my skin, I couldn't stop thinking about how I had felt the last time, how Jake's hands had felt on my back, how his touch had made me feel alive. I hated myself for it, but I couldn't stop remembering. Eventually, Jake came over and sat down next to me, his eyes focused on the horizon. I turned to him, trying to act normal, trying to pretend that nothing had changed between us. "You good?" I asked, my voice casual, as if everything was fine. He nodded, but there was something in the way he looked at me, something in his eyes that made my heart skip a beat. It wasn't the same as before. It wasn't the look of a son looking at his mother. It was different. "I'm fine," he said quietly, his gaze still on the ocean. But there was a tension in his voice, something unspoken, hanging between us. I didn't know how to respond, so I didn't. I just stared at him, trying to understand what had changed, what was happening between us. I didn't want to know the answer. I didn't want to face it. The rest of the day went by in a blur. I tried to distract myself with the waves, with the sound of the seagulls, with the warmth of the sun. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't stop thinking about Jake, about what had happened before, and about what might happen again. The tension was there, between us, thick and undeniable. By the time we packed up and headed back to the car, I felt more lost than I had when we arrived. The silence was heavier than it had been on the way there. Neither of us said much. I couldn't. How could I? I couldn't look at Jake the same way anymore. And I didn't know if he could look at me the same way either. The drive home was filled with the sound of the engine, the rhythmic hum of the tires against the asphalt. I stole a glance at Jake. His face was turned towards the window, his eyes distant. He didn't look at me. And for the first time in a long while, I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to fix this. The days that followed felt like a slow unraveling. It was as if everything around me had been moving in slow motion. But the weight of it all, the guilt, the confusion, the tension, was dragging me down with each passing hour. I couldn't stop thinking about Jake, about what had happened, and about the feeling that had settled between us. Heavy and undeniable. It was suffocating, but it was also the only thing that seemed to make me feel alive. Even if it was wrong, I kept busy. I did what I always did: tended to the kids, cleaned the house, cooked dinner. I went through the motions, all the while trying to ignore the way Jake's presence seemed to fill up every space in the house. It wasn't even that he was doing anything different, it was just the way he looked at me now. The way his eyes seemed to linger on me a little longer than they should. The way his body seemed to stay a little too close. It was like there was an unspoken tension hanging in the air. And no matter how hard I tried to pretend it wasn't there, I couldn't avoid it. Then came the next weekend. Ethan had another work commitment, of course. It seemed like that was all he did anymore. And I had long since stopped questioning it. It was the same old story. Another project. Another late night. Another weekend away. So, it was just Jake and me again. Just the two of us. I didn't plan it. At least, not consciously. But when I found myself standing in the kitchen that Saturday morning, staring out the window, I realized that I was getting ready to do it again. I was going to ask Jake to come with me to the beach. I don't know why I decided to do it. Maybe it was because I needed to feel something. Anything. Outside of the walls of this house. Maybe I thought that a change of scenery would help. Would clear my mind. Would somehow make everything go back to normal. Maybe I wanted to test myself. To see if I could go back to how things used to be, before everything had changed. I don't know. But I called out to Jake as he passed through the living room. "Hey, Jake," I said, my voice a little unsteady. But I tried to hide it. "Want to go to the beach today? Just the two of us?" He stopped, looking at me for a moment. He was leaning against the doorway, and his expression was hard to read. I couldn't tell if he was surprised, confused, or maybe just too tired to care. But after a long pause, he nodded. "Sure, Mom. Sounds good." I didn't ask him what he thought about it or if he had other plans. It didn't matter. It wasn't like we were doing anything wrong. I told myself that, but I knew better. I knew deep down that this wasn't just a simple trip to the beach. It couldn't be. Nothing was simple anymore, not between us. We loaded up the car, beach towels, sunscreen, snacks, and headed out. The drive was quiet again. Jake had his earbuds in, just like before, staring out the window, his face unreadable. I tried to think of something to say, but the words never came. What was there to say? How could I talk to him like this? Like everything was fine? Like we hadn't crossed a line the last time we were alone together? The drive to the beach seemed longer than it usually did. The silence pressing down on me, suffocating me. I kept my eyes on the road, trying to focus on anything other than the nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach. It was the same feeling I had last weekend, when we'd been at the beach, this sense of impending doom. Like we were walking towards something we couldn't turn back from. When we finally arrived, the beach was empty, save for a few scattered families enjoying the warmth of the sun. It was peaceful, almost serene, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the quiet wasn't a comfort, it was a warning. A warning that things between Jake and me were about to change again. That we were about to step deeper into dangerous territory. We set up our towels and umbrella. Jake was quieter than usual, his movements slow and deliberate, as though he was still processing something. I didn't know what to say. So, I just sat down, facing the ocean, and tried to breathe. The sound of the waves crashing against the shore was soothing, but it didn't calm the storm brewing inside me. I couldn't bring myself to ask him again, like I had last time. I couldn't ask him to rub the sunscreen on my back. That would have been crossing a line, wouldn't it? But as I lay there on the towel, feeling the heat of the sun on my skin, I couldn't stop thinking about how I had felt the last time, how Jake's hands had felt on my back, how his touch had made me feel alive. I hated myself for it, but I couldn't stop remembering. Eventually, Jake came over and sat down next to me, his eyes focused on the horizon. I turned to him, trying to act normal, trying to pretend that nothing had changed between us. "You good?" I asked, my voice casual, as if everything was fine. He nodded, but there was something in the way he looked at me, something in his eyes that made my heart skip a beat. It wasn't the same as before. It wasn't the look of a son looking at his mother. It was different. "I'm fine," he said quietly, his gaze still on the ocean. But there was a tension in his voice, something unspoken, hanging between us. I didn't know how to respond. So I didn't. I just stared at him, trying to understand what had changed, what was happening between us. I didn't want to know the answer. I didn't want to face it. The rest of the day went by in a blur. I tried to distract myself with the waves, with the sound of the seagulls, with the warmth of the sun. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't stop thinking about Jake, about what had happened before, and about what might happen again. The tension was there, between us, thick and undeniable. By the time we packed up and headed back to the car, I felt more lost than I had when we arrived. The silence was heavier than it had been on the way there. Neither of us said much. I couldn't. How could I? I couldn't look at Jake the same way anymore. And I didn't know if he could look at me the same way either. The drive home was filled with the sound of the engine, the rhythmic hum of the tires against the asphalt. I stole a glance at Jake. His face was turned towards the window, his eyes distant. He didn't look at me. And for the first time in a long while, I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to fix this. Days passed, but they all felt the same. The silence between Jake and me grew heavier with each moment we spent in the same room. I could feel the invisible distance between us, an unspoken wall that neither of us knew how to tear down. Yet, the closer we got to each other, the more suffocating it became. The air between us had become thick with things neither of us was willing to say. But things we both felt, things we both knew. I had told myself, over and over, that I would stop it, That I would find a way to undo the mistake I had made. To break free from this thing that was slowly consuming us. But every time I tried, I found myself caught, tangled in the web we had woven. The truth was, I was just as trapped as Jake was. We were both stuck in this. Both too scared to speak the words that needed to be said. And too scared to face what had already happened. I spent more time in my head than anywhere else. Replaying everything. The moments when Jake and I had gotten too close. The way his hands had felt on my back. The way he had looked at me. And the way my body had responded. Something inside me had woken up that I couldn't shut down. I hated myself for it. Hated the way I longed for his attention. Even though I knew how wrong it was. And then came the night that changed everything. I didn't plan for it. I didn't see it coming. But somehow, it felt inevitable. I had known for weeks that things couldn't go on like this. That the tension couldn't remain hidden forever. Something had to break. It was late. After dinner, Ethan was working late again. And the house was quiet. Except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the sound of the clock ticking away in the background. Lily was in her room. Already asleep. I was alone with Jake again. The silence was deafening. But this time, I didn't feel the need to fill it with words. Instead, I felt the weight of his presence more than ever. I was sitting on the couch, trying to distract myself with the television. But the images on the screen didn't make sense. I wasn't really watching. My mind was elsewhere, trapped in the prison of my own thoughts. I was torn, caught between guilt and something else. Something I didn't want to acknowledge. I knew it was wrong. But I couldn't stop it. I couldn't stop myself from wanting more. Jake sat down next to me. I didn't even look at him at first. Didn't want to. But I could feel him. I could feel the way his body was just a little too close. The heat of him radiating toward me. The space between us seemed to shrink with each passing second. And I couldn't make it stop. I couldn't pull away. Instead, I stayed there, frozen, my heart pounding in my chest. "Mom," Jake said, his voice low, almost hesitant. I turned toward him then, my breath catching in my throat. The way he was looking at me was different. It wasn't just the look of a son seeking comfort from his mother. No, it was something more, something charged, something dangerous. I could see it in his eyes. The same thing I had seen in myself. I don't know what to do anymore," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. His eyes flickered to my lips, then back to my eyes, searching for something, for an answer, for a way out of this tangled mess we had both found ourselves in. I could feel his hand, just barely brushing mine, the touch enough to send a wave of electricity through my body. I couldn't breathe. My thoughts were a chaotic mess. And yet, at that moment, everything felt crystal clear. I could feel the weight of the decision pressing on me. I could feel the pull between us. The pull to do something I knew would destroy us both. I could feel it in every inch of my skin, every beat of my heart. It was like I was standing on the edge of a cliff. And there was no going back. I wanted to stop. I wanted to pull away. To scream. To tell him to leave. To tell him that we couldn't do this. That this wasn't who we were supposed to be. But I didn't. I didn't move. I didn't say anything. Instead, I found myself leaning closer to him, drawn by some magnetic force I couldn't control. He kissed me then. At first, it was soft, tentative, like neither of us was sure if we were allowed to do this. But then it deepened, and I felt the walls I had spent so long building crumble away. I kissed him back, Because I couldn't stop myself. I didn't want to stop. In that moment, I wasn't thinking about the consequences. I wasn't thinking about the wreckage this would leave behind. All I could think about was how alive it made me feel. How needed I felt. How for the first time in years, I wasn't invisible. But as soon as it happened, I knew it was a mistake. I knew there was no going back. We pulled away, both of us breathless, both of us wide-eyed, as if we were shocked by what had just happened, but also, almost relieved. We were both scared, but there was a part of us, a dark part, that had wanted it more than anything. "I'm sorry," I whispered, barely able to choke out the words. Jake didn't say anything. He didn't need to. We both knew that we had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. It wasn't just a kiss. It wasn't just a mistake. It was the point of no return. I stood up abruptly, my knees shaky, my hands trembling. I can't do this," I said, backing away from him. I didn't know where to go, what to do, but I knew I couldn't stay there. Not after what we had just done. Jake stayed where he was, his eyes on the floor, his face a mask of confusion and fear. I didn't know if he understood everything, but I could see the guilt in his eyes. The same guilt I was feeling. The same realization that we had made a choice that would change everything. I didn't say anything else. I couldn't. I turned and walked away, leaving him behind, but as I closed the door to my room, I knew this wasn't something that could ever be fixed. The line we had crossed couldn't be erased, and neither of us could go back to how things had been before. I lay down on my bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of the moment settle on my chest. I couldn't undo it. We couldn't undo it. And no matter how much I wanted to believe that things would get better, that I could fix it all, I knew deep down that everything had changed. Forever. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Jake, his face, the way he looked at me, the way I had looked at him. It all replayed in my head, over and over, like a broken record, and no matter how many times I tried to tell myself it was just a mistake, that it was something that could be buried and forgotten, I knew the truth. It was far from just a mistake. It was a wound, and it was deep. I could feel the weight of what we had done, crushing down on me. Every second, every minute, I kept thinking, this is it. This is the point where everything falls apart. I had crossed a line I could never uncross. And now there was no escaping it. No running away from what we had become. I thought of Ethan, and the guilt hit me like a tidal wave. Ethan, who had been so distant for so long. Who had never really seen me. Not like Jake had. Not like I needed. I had justified it for so long. I had told myself that his work came first. That I had to be understanding. That he was doing it for the family. But all of that was a lie. All of it. I was the one left behind. Invisible in my own home. And Jake, my own son, had become the one to fill the void. He became the one to see me when no one else did. And that's what scared me the most. Because in some twisted way, I had let it happen. I had let myself want it. I couldn't even look at myself in the mirror anymore. When I stood in front of it, I barely recognized the woman staring back. She wasn't me. She couldn't be. She had let everything fall apart. Had let herself be pulled into something she couldn't control. I didn't know who she was anymore. And I certainly didn't know how to fix her. But I couldn't go back. I couldn't undo what had been done. And that thought paralyzed me. Every time I thought about what would happen if anyone found out, if Ethan ever found out, I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. The fear of the fallout, the destruction it would cause, was overwhelming. Our family would never be the same. It couldn't be. There was no way to erase this, to pretend it didn't happen. The truth was too dark, too ugly to be ignored. And the fear of what might come next, of what Jake might want, of what I might feel, only made everything worse. What had started as a simple moment of weakness had grown into something much larger. Something we couldn't control. I feared the future, feared the consequences, feared the loss of everything I thought I had. I stayed in my room most of the next day. I didn't know how to face Jake, didn't know what to say to him. There were no words left. The distance between us had never felt so wide, so impossible to cross. I didn't know if he felt the same way I did, that fear, that guilt, that overwhelming sense that our lives had been shattered in an instant. Or maybe he was different. Maybe he could pretend like it didn't matter, like it wasn't a big deal. Maybe he could forget, but I couldn't. I couldn't forget what we had done. I couldn't forget how it made me feel. By the time Ethan came home that evening, I was a shell of myself. I didn't have the energy to pretend. I didn't have the strength to make small talk or ask how his day had been. He didn't notice, of course. He never did. He kissed me on the cheek like he always did. But there was nothing behind it. His mind was elsewhere, lost in his work, and I felt invisible all over again. But this time, I didn't mind. In fact, I welcomed it. I was terrified of what would happen if anyone ever found out. If the secret I shared with Jake was ever exposed, the truth would destroy everything. And I couldn't bear the thought of the wreckage it would cause. That night, as I lay in bed, I tried to push the thoughts away. I tried to sleep, but it was impossible. The weight of what I had done, what we had done, kept me awake, drowning me in fear. My mind kept racing. What now? What happens next? How can I live with this? The truth was, I didn't know. I didn't know how to move forward from here, or if I even could. All I knew was that nothing would ever be the same again. I couldn't tell anyone. I couldn't even tell Ethan. How could I? How could I explain what had happened without tearing apart everything we had built? The thought of losing my family, of seeing the pain in Ethan's eyes, was too much to bear. But the thought of losing Jake, of losing him to something we could never undo, was even worse. The silence between us was deafening now. It wasn't just the silence of not speaking. It was the silence of knowing that we had both made choices that had irreparably changed us. It was the silence of living in fear of what would come next, of knowing that our lives were hanging by a thread, and any moment could unravel it all. I had always thought that love, that family, would protect me from the worst parts of life. I thought that as long as we stayed together, as long as we held onto the pieces of what we had, we would be okay. But now I realized that I had been wrong. Love wasn't enough. Family wasn't enough. And no matter how much I tried to hold on, no matter how much I wanted to pretend it didn't happen, I couldn't erase the truth. There was no going back, no undoing the damage that had been done. I didn't know how to fix this. I didn't know if it could ever be fixed. And for the first time in my life, I was truly, completely, and utterly terrified. I thought that after everything, after the fear, the guilt, The endless nights spent trying to pretend that things weren't falling apart. I would eventually find a way to fix it. I thought that maybe, just maybe, if I tried hard enough, I could put the pieces of my life back together. But that was before I truly understood the cost of what I had done. Before I realized that some things can't be undone, no matter how much you want them to be. Every day felt like I was walking a tightrope, one misstep away from losing everything. The quiet between Jake and me had become suffocating. The space between us had stretched further than I ever thought possible. Yet at the same time, I could feel the weight of his presence constantly. Even when we weren't in the same room, it felt like he was there, like the air between us was charged with something we couldn't escape. I tried to pretend that everything was okay. I tried to act like it was just a rough patch, that things would go back to normal if I just held on long enough. But deep down, I knew the truth. There was no going back. The moment we crossed that line, the moment we let the silence between us grow into something else, everything had changed. I could feel it in my bones. In every glance, in every awkward silence. Our relationship, my family, was fractured beyond repair. I couldn't look at Ethan without feeling the weight of the lie I was living. He was still so distant, so caught up in his work, and yet I couldn't escape the truth that I had betrayed him. Not just with my actions, but with the part of me that had long since stopped being fully present. I had justified my loneliness for so long, telling myself that it was his fault, that his neglect had pushed me to this point. But I was wrong. I had chosen to ignore the signs. I had chosen to stay in the silence, to let the years of neglect define me. And now, I was paying the price. The worst part was that I didn't know how to fix it. I didn't know how to stop the damage from spreading. How do you come back from a mistake like this? How do you rebuild a life when the foundation has been shattered? The truth was, I didn't know, and that terrified me. As the days turned into weeks, I found myself growing more distant, not just from Jake, but from everything. From Ethan, from Lily, from myself. I couldn't look at my family without seeing the cracks in everything, cracks that I had created. Cracks that were too deep to fill. I could feel the weight of my own decisions crushing me. I had let myself slip so far into a place I couldn't control. And now it was too late to change anything. Every time I tried to speak to Jake, every time I tried to act like everything was okay, I felt the distance between us widening. Felt the chasm we had created become an abyss that neither of us knew how to cross. There were moments, rare moments, when I caught a glimpse of who I used to be. Moments when I felt the weight of the past. When I remembered what it was like to be a mother, to be a wife, to be someone who mattered. But those moments were fleeting, and they only served to remind me how far I had fallen. One evening, as I sat alone in the kitchen, the quiet of the house pressing in on me, I realized something. I realized that I was no longer the person I had once been. I was no longer the woman who held everything together. The woman who could protect her family from the darkness. I had let the darkness in. And now it was too late to push it out. I had crossed a line. And now, all I had left was the aftermath. I thought about leaving, about walking away from it all. But where would I go? What would I do? There was no escaping the consequences of my actions. No matter how far I ran, they would follow me. They would haunt me, just like they had already begun to. And then, for the first time, I realized that I didn't know if I even wanted to escape. The truth, however painful, had become a part of me. I had let it in. I had let myself become consumed by it. And now, there was no turning back. There was no redemption, no forgiveness. I spent the next few days in a haze, moving through the motions without really living. Ethan continued his endless work, oblivious to the storm that was raging just beneath the surface of our family. Lily remained innocent, unaware of the cracks forming in our lives. And Jake was a constant presence in my mind. But even as I saw the look of guilt and confusion in his eyes, even as I saw how much he was struggling with what we had done, I knew there was no way to fix it. Not for him, not for me. The truth was, we had broken something that couldn't be repaired. Our family, our bond, it was shattered. And there was no way to put the pieces back together. The hardest thing to accept, however, was that I wasn't just afraid of losing everything. I was afraid of losing myself. I had been so caught up in the lies, the guilt, the fear, that I had lost who I was. I didn't know what it meant to be a mother anymore. I didn't know what it meant to be a wife. And worst of all, I didn't know what it meant to be me. As I sat in the darkness, staring at the kitchen table, I realized that there was no happy ending to this story. No easy fix, no way to undo what had been done. I had made my choices, and now I had to live with them. The price I had paid was steep, and the future, if there was any future at all, would never be the same. There was no going back, and that was the most terrifying truth of all.